So I want the content today, I'm hoping will be useful whether you're currently using our firewall or using someone else's firewall, or heaven forbid not using a firewall. Hopefully there's no one that fits that definition here. But this is a little bit of the agenda, so we'll talk a little bit about the kind of changing trends and the firewall landscape, again, more vendor neutral. We'll talk about our vision and strategy to firewall. What's new? So we'll talk about some of the new hardware platform options, virtual options, things like that, as well as some of the new features. And those will also be kind of woven into some of the core firewall use cases we see for our platform, or even for that matter, for a firewall period. Toward the bottom, we'll talk about best practices and some resources. I will say the best practices are mostly around our firewall specifically, but everything else, will kind of be equally valuable no matter what you're using today. So, and this is a pretty small, intimate group, so feel free to stop and ask questions at any point. Love for this to be interactive. Want you guys to get as much out of this as possible. So, we'll talk a little bit about firewall trends. These are some new challenges we're seeing around infrastructure. One that's come up and maybe is easing a bit, but it's probably going to be there to some extent to stay, is hybrid work, right? So we saw kind of a spike in that a couple of years ago as everyone's suddenly working remotely. It was more of a remote work scenario than a hybrid work scenario at the time. And we saw suddenly needs for remote access spiking, right? We had customers that maybe had, my larger accounts, one of them had, 10,000 people as a daily peak for VPN, and they suddenly had 50,000 people as a VPN peak. Well, our firewall that we have for VPN is not going to cut it anymore. We need to scale out. We have a rising kind of constant sophistication of global attacks around the internet. Some of that also is kind of running against the rise in encrypted traffic, right? So I remember even 7 years ago, most of the malware was still plain text, even though legitimate sites were encrypted. So it was really easy a lot of times to spot the malicious stuff. That's all moved to encryption. If I were a malware developer, I would certainly use Let's Encrypt, which lets me get free, SSL certificates, right? Who wouldn't? And now that is something hidden. So how do we handle the rise in encrypted traffic from a malicious perspective, right? It's great from a privacy perspective, especially if you're at home or you're at a coffee shop or a hotel. It presents challenges if you're an enterprise trying to protect your networks and your users. And then we have, continuing unpredictability just as things change rapidly throughout technology. And these all, impact the world of firewall. So this just kind of talks about, the rise to a multi-cloud environment. We have, all kinds of clouds. All of you, I'm sure, have at least one cloud, probably a VMware, KVM, some kind of, what they would term a private cloud on site. Show of hands, is anyone using public cloud today? Maybe not something like an Office 365, but spinning up servers in AWS, Azure, Google, Rackspace. Anyone approaching that these days?
We've got a couple of AWS stuff.
A couple of them, yeah. I would expect that the number will go up over time rather than down, right? I will say, I support mostly public sector. In a lot of cases, public sector has been maybe a little bit slower to adopt. They get the state governments and stuff, and you see more of that. But it's going to be a part of the landscape going forward. So, right, you guys probably know this story and are probably saying this to other people at your own employers. But once upon a time, we would put the firewall at the edge of our network. All of our data is kind of safe and protected inside of that. And now we have stuff everywhere. Right? We have personal devices. Sometimes those connect in, sometimes they don't. If I'm at a university, for instance, like I basically got to let personal devices on, and maybe those personal devices need to access parts of my network, right? Even corporate enterprise, I've seen commercial customers where they let people VPN in from their personal devices because maybe they're suddenly remote and they don't have the funds to give them a laptop to take home, right? Maybe their only system is a desktop. We have kind of hybrid cloud. We have different applications living in the cloud, both software as a service style applications as well as actual virtual servers and workloads in the cloud. So the firewall, the good news, can still be a solution for all of this, but we want to kind of rethink what maybe to some extent what a firewall is or means, and then rethink kind of where strategically we would want to place a firewall. I will say, just as a quick side note, we can send everyone these decks at the end So don't feel like you're going to miss any of this info if you don't snap a photo of it or whatever. We'll also have, for a couple of references, we'll have some QR codes on the screen too for different links and stuff, so you guys can take a picture. I'm gonna try and stand. I feel a little awkward sitting, so but maybe I'll go back to it in a second. So Cisco's vision and strategy. The firewall market today is composed of a few different things. We have network security that can be consumed in a variety of means. So we have, our physical firewalls. I assume most of you are probably running at least one physical firewall today. We have virtual firewalls, and those can run on basically any cloud provider, whether that's your VMware or KVM back at the shop, whether that's AWS, Google Cloud. Other parts of the world right have other cloud providers, Alibaba's cloud, all the different kind of clouds around the world. We support just about all of them. And if there's a major one we're missing and we get customers asking for it, the strategy at this point is we will try and as rapidly as possible get it out for them as well. And then we have some cloud native firewall solutions. And the idea is that, kind of no matter where someone is, what they're trying to connect to, what resource they're trying to access, that there is a way to secure that connection. This is actually, now that I'm looking at it, a very similar kind of diagram, but there are different kind of components when it comes to a firewall. So one thing we'll talk a little bit today is about workload and how do we secure a workload. So if we think a workload as an abstract concept, we traditionally think server, but a workload could live in a container, it could live in a virtual machine, it could be a physical, physical 1U server slid into a rack, or it could be something that lives in multiple places, multiple different points at once. If you think about like a modern infrastructure, right, like an Amazon workload, right, in the cloud, might be a web front end, a database, different systems running scripting, all kind of running together to make this one thing that the user interacts with. And we'll talk about zero trust a little bit too, and we'll talk a little bit about what's new. So a little bit over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we rolled out what we call Cisco Secure Firewall 7.x. You'll see this term Cisco Secure Firewall. That's the new branding for our platform. So some of you may be familiar with the term firepower or firepower threat defense. So the term we use now is Cisco Secure Firewall. You may hear me slip here and there and accidentally say firepower. That I'm referring to the same thing. There's a bunch of new refinements we've made to the platform with the 7.x. And I'll call out a couple of them. One of them is we have made a more modern next-gen IPS framework. So if you guys are familiar with the bones of our product, we have a process that runs on our firewalls called Snort. Anyone familiar with Snort? Show of hands. Yeah, several of you. So Snort's been around for a long time. It was started in the late 90s by Marty Retsch, and the developers of Snort were called SourceFire. They were acquired by Cisco now a number of years ago. We have been running for the last almost 20 years what's called Snort 2. It's developed in the early 2000s. Anyone running a non-Cisco firewall is most likely running Snort 2 or a derivative of that as well. It's like the global engine used for processing intrusion detections. So we have rolled out in this new platform what's called Snort 3. It is the next-gen version. It is a multi-threaded native version of Snort. So when we have these multiple CPU cores and the general kind of modern multi-threaded architecture designed for a platform, our new Snort engine lives within that. A little side note is when you switch to Snort 3 on your firewall, you roughly get about a 30% performance boost on the same hardware you're already running, which I think is super cool. There's a lot of other new features that come with Snort beyond just the fact that it can multi-thread under the hood. That'll be benefits to you going forward. We'll get into that in a little more detail later. We have some really cool new features around simplifying branch deployments, so some new WAN management capabilities, as well as different capabilities for doing what we would term intelligent path selection. So being able to set up policy-based routes, monitoring the different routes, and having dynamically flow packets where you need them to go. Another thing that we'll dig into in a little bit is something called our Cisco Secure Dynamic Attribute Connector. And again, we'll get into more detail. But the idea is that if you have infrastructure and you know a lot of things about your infrastructure, like we'll use the vCenter example. vCenter knows the names of my hosts, knows the vSwitches they're on, knows the operating systems they're running, all these properties about the hosts. If I have firewall rules where I'm dropping hosts in that meet certain criteria, like we have a rule for Ubuntu updates, and it's Ubuntu servers that are powered on, that are in these different VLANs, that are on these vSwitches, here's my criteria. Well, what's my process for giving those Ubuntu servers access to the updates that they need via the firewall? Well, the server team spins one up. Once it's spun up, they open a help desk ticket. The next day, the firewall team puts it in. That night, it gets deployed, and then 2 days later, the Ubuntu server can now get to the internet. Wouldn't it be cool if we could set that criteria, and within seconds of the new server being spun up that meets that criteria, it dynamically has access to what it needs. So we'll dive into that a little bit as well. And when you see some other things on here, there's a lot of really cool things we've been working on with 7.x. The next thing I want to mention is our new firewall platform. So we rolled this out last calendar year, our Cisco Secure Firewall 3100 series. If you guys have not heard about this, this is a pretty amazing enhancement to our lineup. So based on the numbering, for those of you familiar with our other firewall models, we have a 2100 series and a 4100 series. This sits nicely in the middle from a price perspective, but I will tell you it overlaps very strongly with the performance of the 4100 series while being substantially less expensive. We have made some kind of brand new enhancements to the platform, that things that the other ones don't do that this one can do. One is we've redesigned the whole architecture for crypto acceleration. More and more now we have people needing to do some sort of SSL inspection, or they're doing more and more maybe tunnels or VPN. These different kind of use cases, they all require the firewall itself to perform cryptographic functions. So this new design, which is FPGA based, and it is in line with the flow of traffic, gives us exponential improvements in VPN and encryption inspection performance. And again, if you're familiar with our model numbers, the 3140 can outperform the highest end 9300 when it comes to encryption tasks. So pretty cool stuff. We have a flow accelerator, which is something that I'm pretty excited about too in this platform. So if you designate something as what's called a fast path or trust rules, this is for specifically trusted traffic, the firewall can dynamically load those specific connections when it sees and match those rules into the hardware of the firewall. And the rest of those connections or flows can flow through at your line rate without having to go into the software stack of the firewall at all for inspection. So it's a way that we can dynamically extend the capabilities of the platform just by simply marking certain flows as trusted. We do support FIPS compliance out of the box, so if you have those requirements, that's another thing. And of course, we have encrypted SSDs, which again just means a faster, more robust platform. So I covered probably a lot of this already, right? So one thing that's cool, I'll dive into the VPN a little bit more because I find this pretty fascinating. When you go to a firewall's data sheet and look at its VPN performance numbers, again, regardless of vendor, they will invariably give you a number of the highest that it can do, right? Generally, a firewall cannot do anywhere near the full bandwidth of VPN with a single tunnel or connection, right? So if I have a firewall that can do 30 gigs of VPN throughput, but I support 10,000 VPN sessions, and certainly when I'm at 10,000, they're sharing probably that full, capability. But when I just have one session, I'm not going to get that 30 gig. I'm probably going to get 1 gig or 1.5 gig, maybe at tops. And that just has to do with how crypto kind of cores are designed and the way that those are distributed and VPN connections are distributed across those cores. So with our new design, which is FPGA based, and I don't claim to be the hardware designer of the product or anything, we have tested in a single flow up to 40 gigs per second of VPN performance, with a total throughput capacity of that same box being about 40 gigs per second. So the design has been kind of, again, re-architected from the ground up to get you very highly scalable VPN performance on this hardware. So pretty cool stuff. This is another thing. We have a concept called multi-instance where you can kind of carve out the firewall into multiple logical firewalls. We can dive into that later or offline or out of band if you don't have questions during the break on it. But support for that's coming here in a few months as well. This gives you an idea of the performance boost. And the reason we specify these source and kind of before and after models is they are comparable in price. So just to give you an idea of the performance differences that you would have based on, again, very similar price points. You can see a pretty dramatic difference in performance. And there we go, a little bit more building of the slide there. But yeah, up to 17x performance boost for the same price and I can set VPN at 14 performance boosts in TLS, which will be both like TLS VPN as well as TLS inspection. Mentioned this earlier, but here's just some nice graphics for you and things that I hadn't thought of, like Equinix. I'm sure we have a bunch of Equinix customers in the house running Equinix Cloud. But we support basically every private public cloud that you would probably want. Importantly, if anyone is under any kind of FedRAMP or very stringent requirements around compliance and stuff, we do support the 3 major cloud environments in the US as well. You can see down here some of the cloud native features of cloud environments, and if any of you are dipping your toes in, you'll find that they handle things differently. One just basic example is there's like generally no layer 2 in the cloud. I mean, there is, I'm sure, under the hood, there's still routing packets, but you as a user don't get exposed to layer 2. You can't, for instance, set up a layer 2 connection between devices. Everything is IP based. So the way that clustering works is a little bit different in the cloud. We've worked with all these different cloud providers to support their native frameworks for how they handle all the kind of different rudimentary paths that just require a rethink around how those things work. A really popular concept in cloud is what's called a gateway load balancer. So rather than having a cluster design, like an AWS, as traffic comes in through the gateway there, they will load balance, or give you the option to kind of load balance across multiple security devices. We support all of that natively. You can even do dynamic scaling, so as your needs increase, it can auto spin up a new firewall that's kind of pre-configured with a golden image, auto-registered to your FMC, and giving you that scalable performance. And then maybe it turns itself off when it's done, so you can save that per hour costing that AWS is charging you. Any questions so far? I feel like I've been talking a lot. So.
Is there an upgrade path from a 2140 to a 3120?
Yeah.
I just got it like 11 months ago.
Gotcha. Well, it depends what you mean by upgrade path, but certainly it's very possible to migrate and things like that, policies. And actually, in fact, the new 7.4 code will have a built-in kind of device-to-device migration to go to the 3100 series. If that's more from a sales perspective, I will do the opposite of what Aaron was doing to me and take it over to him. So, yeah, in all of my talk of the 3100s, by the way, I'm not trying to denigrate any of the other platforms. That tends to happen with newer hardware, right? As you get better performance. And again, the encryption stuff is pretty awesome for a new one. So, one thing we'll talk a little bit about too is, as you have all these different concepts of where you want to put a firewall, which could be public cloud, private cloud, physical, etc. We've done some work toward unifying cloud and on-premises management. So we have now a cloud-managed or cloud-delivered FMC option, so you can manage all of your firewalls from a manager that is offered as a software as a service type solution, right? So instead of buying an FMC and installing it in your data center or running it in vCenter, if you want to, you can now consume it as a SaaS offer. SaaS-delivered FMC can manage all of your on-premise firewalls, can manage any that you put in public cloud. And just as a side note, if you choose to keep your FMC on site virtually or physically, it can also manage firewalls that are in public cloud. So you can kind of put all of the different pieces wherever you want and manage them, and we have ways that that they can connect to each other. So yeah, a little bit more about the cloud-delivered FMC. We have the same look and feel, and I'll give you guys a demo here in a second of the new cloud-delivered FMC, and you'll see I don't have to relearn anything. It's basically all the same. We do have what we would term a brownfield migration, meaning that we can, if you're already using our firewalls elsewhere, there's a path for migrating up to 1,000 of them in the cloud. We're actually hoping to scale out to support at least 3,000 firewalls on a single FMC in the cloud. We have some like retail entities and stuff like that in the commercial sphere where they want to be able to, if I'm the Gap, right, I have 500 locations, it would be cool to manage them all from the cloud. I said 500, but we have some, banks and stuff like that where you have thousands of firewalls on each site. Since it is SaaS, you don't have to refresh hardware, you don't have to plan your own maintenance windows to upgrade code. So we ensure all uptime and patching and updates. SOC 2 compliance is in there. We also support, configuration backups and all that kind of stuff for you. And a couple other things. We have one thing that I'll mention. This is coming in the summer, I believe. We have what's called Secure Firewall as a Service. So if you guys are familiar with AWS, they have a lot of offerings where you are billed by the hour. You spin a service up, you're charged for it while it's there, you destroy it when you're done. So we are actually bringing that model to AWS, where through AWS itself, you'll be able to grab one of our firewalls. It's pre-configured with all the subscriptions built in on the hourly rate. Use it, turn it off when you're done with it. So that could be a cool option for testing. Or again, if I have peak times where I need to dynamically increase the amount of firewalls I have and then be able to decrease them, buying a 3-year license of subscriptions from us doesn't really suit that model. So we have this kind of scalable method as well, which is pretty cool. So this is just a kind of snapshot back and forth. And I will give you a demo, but these are kind of both FMCs, right? We have the on-prem one, we have the cloud one, with a very few couple different differences, like this little weird sidebar, and the fact that it says Defense Orchestrator at the top, and it is the same firewall manager that you've used historically. We also have a new framework for doing scalable event aggregation, what we call security analytics and logging. This is pretty cool as well. There's a version that runs on-prem, virtually or physically, and one that runs in the cloud. Right now, the beefiest FMC that we make, our FMC 4600, it can scale up to 20,000 events that it ingests from the firewalls per second, right? That's a lot of events. But if you have a gigantic network, we have a bunch of firewalls, some customers need more than that. So this new scalable event aggregation tool will scale up to 100,000 events per second, and actually can get even higher than that with different cluster designs. But with a single kind of VM even, it can do 100,000 events per second. What's really cool about the on-prem one is it's also designed so that it has a single unified interface within the FMC. And what that means is under the hood, right? My firewalls are sending their eventing data to this separate like VM or physical appliance. And if I'm in my FMC and I go to like my analysis, my connection events or unified event screens, those different views where I look at my firewall logs, under the hood, the FMC is making an API query to this separate box. All of your events come in like normal, so you just continue using the FMC as you always have. But you have this scalable architecture now. The other cool thing is I had a customer recently, and I think they were getting like a week of maybe log retention on their FMC, and it was something like 7 years that the basic VM option would give them for event retention. So if you need to store events longer and you don't have something like Splunk sitting there on-prem to use, this is a really great option. It's also priced to be dramatically lower in cost than buying a SIM or something like that. So another thing that we have rolled out.